I actually grew up in the land of the living skies, where Tommy Douglas founded Medicare, and in a rural area where my family was very proud of Medicare and the social solidarity that they felt that brought, but that are now falling prey to the Facebook memes that are trying to divide us about refugees getting access to more than Canadians have. And so that colors my understanding of our current context significantly. I think a lot about, and I work for a public sector union that represents a lot of the lower wage public sector workers. And so I think a lot about solidarity and how that plays out in our society. How do we create more of it? Where has it gone? And power. And I really I thought it was very eloquent how Lars said that policy reinforces and reflects power dynamics. So you can get yourself into a scenario where those power dynamics are going more and more in one direction without necessarily changing policy all that much. And it becomes neutral. It seems like it's not a decision, it's just natural that corporations have so much power in our society because they're the job creators, and that's how it should be. And actually, John Jacobs is back there, and I was supposed to write a paper for him when I was in undergrad about how that works. And I never did it. I'm sorry, John. So I think that universal services, universal public services, are one way, a key way that we create social solidarity. And that we fight back against the ways that the powerful try to divide us. And I'm also right now a candidate in the federal election, so all of my stories now start with, I was knocking on a door and. And so I've been knocking on doors, and people have told me the stories about how the current healthcare system has failed them. A woman this morning whose husband was in a long-term care home, who he didn't get the care that he needed, and he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer because he had been rushed to the ER. She had been raising concerns for months with the his healthcare provider, but he was rushed to the ER and they gave him 2 days to live. And she has no recourse. And now she's worried about her friend who also is in that same healthcare facility. And so what we have seen at the macroeconomic level, we saw the debt panic in the 90s that then resulted in Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien slashing transfers to provinces. And then that resulted in provinces having decades of austerity and cutting back on healthcare and education and these critical social services that develop that social solidarity that we need to survive as a society, as a healthy society that is inclusive. Because this woman's friend this morning said she's been waiting for 8 years on the list to get into social housing. She pays more than 50% of her rent, or her income in rent, and she said, what about the refugees? Are they getting all the social housing spots? And so you can see how in people's lives, when they're struggling, when the system has failed them, it's very easy to point fingers at the other. And it's very easy for us to be divided. And so I think we should absolutely propose all the tax measures that Toby has proposed, but we should run deficits to immediately repair our social safety net and go beyond repairing, because there are pieces of it that we never implemented that are so necessary for people. When I'm knocking on doors and I say to someone, okay, our plan is we're gonna tax the rich, they're like, yeah, that's awesome. And I've never gotten this before. I've campaigned before and said we should tax the rich. And people are like, well, aren't they gonna leave Canada then? That's not what you're getting now. It's not. The conversation has shifted. We have gotten to the point where everybody sees that the social safety net is frayed beyond repair, that it is unfair, that corporations have too much power and people have not enough power. So when I say we're going to tax the rich a little bit more, they're like, how much more? I tell them the $20 billion wealth tax. They're like, that's not enough. What about people who make $300,000 a year? That's an unimaginable number for most people. That's 10 times the average income in Canada. If we could tax me more, we should. And that's Andrew Jackson, who's also in the audience somewhere. That was his policy test that he told me when I started at the CLC, was if he benefited from a policy, that it was probably bad. So I'm knocking on doors, I'm telling people we're gonna tax the rich more, and they're like, that's great. And I said, we're gonna invest it in healthcare, we're gonna invest it in building new affordable housing, and we're gonna invest it in climate action. And they're like, that's great. How quickly can you get started? And I say, okay, well, we can get universal pharmacare up within a year. We've committed to getting dental care for households with less than $70,000 within a year. We've committed to building more affordable housing. That's going to take a little bit longer because you have to find the land and you have to do that. And they're like, okay, yeah, but we need it now. I've been waiting, again, 8 years for social housing. And I've knocked on doors for people who live in social housing, and they're like, they won't fix the leak in my wall, they just come and paint it over. They won't fix the cockroaches in my building, they just come and smoke them and they go to the next apartment. So they smoke my apartment, but not my neighbors. And so it doesn't get rid of them. And so many pieces of our social safety net are fragmented. Public transit, it costs as much to get a bus pass as it does to park in a garage. And it's reliable. So people are like, yeah, no, I don't take the bus because it doesn't make sense to take the bus. It's actually cheaper and more effective to drive. So why don't we have free public transit? And again, knocking on doors, and I say to people, well, we want to make public transit free. And they're like, oh, free? I don't know about that. And I said, well, roads are free. And they kind of think. They're like, oh, it didn't occur to them that it costs money to build roads. So they're trying to understand, why do I think that it's okay for roads to be free and not that it's okay for buses to be free? Why do I think it's okay for high school to be free but not for college to be free? And so we have all kinds of assumptions that people are starting to reevaluate and starting to understand the importance of in terms of building that social solidarity. And people are desperate for community. The way that we've structured our lives now, people are spending so much time commuting to and from work, and they don't live near a park or a recreation center or some other type of social connection, that people don't have that in their lives. So they're dying out for that social connection, and that's another thing that actually appeals to people in terms of the alt-right. It's a community where they're understood and they're not vilified because they don't understand what the right word is for something. And so that's why one of the things that I think is also really important is obviously urban planning, urban design, how do we create communities like that, but also supporting economic democracy, so credit unions, cooperatives, helping to rebuild local communities and social networks and economic networks so that people aren't alienated in the way that they are today, which makes them prime targets to be exploited. And finally, the fair vote person that asked the question about fair vote. I think that the way our current political system is set up is that it makes sense for politicians to exploit this divide. And so I see Justin Trudeau go to Saskatoon to make an apology about blackface. And it makes me furious because he thinks my family are racist and will give him a pass on having blackface. So he uses the ignorance of my community to excuse himself from his bad behavior. And so he creates a further wedge in between people that he thinks are educated and people that he thinks are not. And that is not acceptable. That is not progressive, and that is not okay. I think we need to have conversations with our friends and family who don't understand why we have so many refugees in Canada or how they get their services, or don't understand that Muslims have the same God that Christians have. It's literally the same books in the Bible, right? My sister is so worried about Muslims, and I told her they believed in angels too. And that just like clicked a little switch in her head. She's like, whoa, really? And so there's more that we have in common than that divides us. But the way that our political system is set up, information divides us. And the conservatives use it, the liberals use it, and everyone else is confused and frustrated. They don't see themselves reflected in their leaders. This is what I get when I knock on doors. People are frustrated. They don't trust anyone. They're like, I don't think anyone understands what I'm going through. I see this bickering. I see this divisiveness. I see this basic lack of understanding and integrity of thought and words. So things that are not true, things that ought to be known to be not true, pass for punditry, for example. So our pundit class goes largely unchallenged by our journalist class because they don't have either the diversity or the time to investigate it. All of this, I think, goes back to solidarity and the understanding that if we had the core needs met of housing, of community, of health, that it would be all of these other challenges that we face, the climate crisis, racism, the global uncertainty, would be much easier for us to weather, and we could come out the other side, I think, a lot stronger. Thank you.